Have you ever checked out an anime or manga or even a TV show that was well regarded among your friends or a community and you end up feeling a little overwhelmed with it, or even outright just disliking it? And then when you're discussing with someone, they end up giving that same old good reply, "It gets better later on." And then you think about it and you give it another chance, and sure, it did get better, but you still don't like it. Why is that? Is it simply that despite getting better, it's still not good? Well, that might be the case, but I don't think it's necessarily that every time. Rather, I think there's an inherent problem with stories getting better later on, or actually even multiple problems. And today I decided to dedicate a short video just exploring the topic. The "it gets better" expression is extremely common, and it's used as much as it's hated. But I do understand why so many people do go back to it. Simply put, there is a lot of manga that gets better later on, and I'm saying manga here because this is a manga channel, but it really applies to any medium. One Piece is a great example. A lot of the good parts of the story happens hundreds upon hundreds of chapters into it, and it's hard to see someone say that One Piece sucks when they dropped it at the beginning of the Usopp arc, when you know that the Marineford is so much better than that arc could ever hope to be. A more recent example, and one that doesn't require dozens of volumes, is Undead Unluck. To anyone hyped with the current events, it's very hard to go back to the very first chapters and recommend it to people without blurring something out about the manga getting a lot better later on. And of course, the biggest critique that these kinds of comments get is that the story should be able to captivate you from the very beginning. If it didn't, it clearly failed somewhere, and that's why chapter and episode 1s are so important. And I feel that that's somewhat true. I'm not saying that the stories need to start with their best and most hyped part, but if they don't engage you from the get-go, you don't really owe it any more time of your life. After all, time is a limited resource, and the hours that we lose to reach that coveted part will never return. With so much content in the world for us to consume, it's really impossible for us to consume everything, so to prioritize things that engage us from the get-go is only natural. But while this is the most common point that people talk about, it's not the reason why I made this video. I want to talk about another problem. I think the reason why we end up not enjoying the story, even if we put in the effort to reach the so-called better parts, is that more often than not, you'll reach the later parts of the story without any investment over the characters, the plot, or the world. And that will massively impact how you enjoy those later parts compared to someone who liked the story from the very beginning. For example, the part that really got me into One Piece was in Alabasta, when Crocodile first defeats Luffy. That was 100 and something chapters into it, and it was the moment that made One Piece jump to be my favorite manga of all time. At least at the time. And I think everyone can agree that telling new people to just skip to that part because it's the best one would not work. They would not get the same impact that I got from that scene because they're not invested in Luffy or Vivi or the people of Alabasta. They don't have any reasons to want to see Crocodile be defeated, nor have any concept of why that moment is so important to see Luffy be humbled for the very first time. Ultimately, the reason why I enjoyed that moment was because I already enjoyed One Piece somewhat up to that point. I enjoyed the writing in East Blue, I enjoyed the personalities the Straw Hats, I enjoyed a little bit of the world that we saw up to that point. I enjoyed a lot of things to some degree or another, and that led me to fully enjoy this arc and everything, or almost everything at least, that came after it. But people who didn't like One Piece at all up till Alabasta and just reading to see how much better it gets are likely to have an experience very more similar to people who skip arcs than me. Simply put, they don't care about Luffy or Vivi or see Crocodile be defeated. They are also quite unlikely to think that Crocodile vs Luffy is an amazing fight if they don't like fights with Arlong or Don Krieg, for example. And I had this experience when reading Jujutsu Kaisen. When I did my very first video on this channel, I talked about the fact that I didn't feel connected with the manga, and I got a lot of comments telling me that I should read up to Shibuya because if I read it at that point, I would love the manga. The hilarious part, of course, being that I was completely caught up with the manga when I said that. Shibuya didn't make me love Jujutsu Kaisen, and the reason for it was exactly the same reason as I just talked about. Jujutsu Kaisen lost me pretty early. Only 20 chapters into it, I already felt myself feeling a little bit disconnected with the characters, the plot, the power system, and the battle writing. And that disconnect only increased as I kept forcing myself to read the manga each and every week. That isn't to say that there are moments or characters in the story that I don't like, but whenever we go back to the main plot and the main cast, I find myself struggling to continue again. The big that I'm not gonna reveal in Shibuya gave me zero feelings. Best I got me thinking, that is sure is a bold move from Gege. Like, Yes. And if that's my experience with Jujutsu Kaisen, why should I expect other people to feel different with series that I like? And that doesn't say that you can't enjoy series later on. Of course, that's possible. For example, I quite enjoyed the second half of Demon Slayer, despite the fact that I think the first is very flawed. But even that first half, I enjoyed Tanjiro and Zenitsu and Inosuke, so when the plot and pacing finally improved, I finally was able to fully enjoy the manga. I also had a friend who absolutely hated Gintama, and he trashed it almost daily up to the point where he reached episode 100 or so. After that, he completely changed his mind and he quickly rose to be his favorite anime of all time, and he recommends it almost daily as well. So it's not impossible, but I still think it's quite unfair to expect people to enjoy a later arc of a story if they don't like the foundation of it. But what about you? What do you think? Just let me know in the comments below, and consider subscribing if you like manga content. On your left should be a link to another discussion, this time talking about people getting too old for reading manga. And if you watch still here, thank you very much, and I'll see you next video.